All right, listeners, ready for a deep dive into Rousseau?
Always up for some Rousseau.
Especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC, and I know a lot of you are out there. This stuff is like gold for international relations, right?
Absolutely foundational. Can't really understand the social contract, critiques of inequality, or even modern IR theory without grappling with his ideas.
Okay, so today we're zeroing in on two key Rousseauian concepts.
Two biggies, yeah.
First, how private property leads to inequality, and second, how that whole idea links back to his state of nature versus civil society argument.
It gets deep, but trust me, it's relevant, even today. Centuries later, Rousseau still has a lot to say about the world we live in.
So let's start with that state of nature thing. Most people, they hear that and they think Hobbes, right?
Yeah.
Total chaos.
Yeah, nasty, brutish, and short, that whole bit.
Everyone's fighting for survival, no rules, no morality. But Rousseau flips that script completely, doesn't he?
He does. For Rousseau, the natural person is actually a noble savage, inherently good, compassionate, and basically equal to everyone else.
Noble savage, interesting term. So, not exactly the caveman we usually imagine.
Not even close. For Rousseau, it's society that corrupts us, makes us sickly, evil, intelligent, and highly unequal.
Whoa. So, if we're naturally good, how do we end up so unequal? This is where private property enters the picture, right?
You got it. That's the turning point for Rousseau. The moment private property shows up, bam, the ideal state of nature is shattered. Why? Dependence?
Dependence. Okay, explain that.
Think about it. In the state of nature, you rely on yourself and what nature provides. But with private property, suddenly we're all relying on each other.
Right, for trade, for resources, all of that.
Exactly. And that creates hierarchies, sets the stage for inequality. Rousseau uses that vivid image, the first man who fences off a piece of land and says, "This is mine." Seems so simple, but
But it changes everything. I love that quote. It's so powerful.
it's a cornerstone of his philosophy. And it clashes head-on with someone like Adam Smith, who believed self-interest, often through private property, was the engine of economic growth and, get this, greater equality.
Wait, hold up. Adam Smith, the capitalism guy,
Yeah.
arguing for equality. How does that work?
Smith's view was that within a well-regulated market, individual ambition leads to more wealth overall, lifting everyone up, making society more prosperous. Rousseau, though, countered that private property inevitably creates disparity, divides us. This tension between individual gain and what's good for society as a whole, that's still a core debate, especially in international relations when we're looking at global economics and development.
It's a huge question, for sure. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting to me. Rousseau wasn't saying all inequality is bad, was he? He actually recognized different types of inequality.
Right, he did. He acknowledged natural inequalities, things like differences in age or physical strength. And he was okay with inequalities that came from serving the community, like rewarding people for their contributions. It was the artificial inequalities he was really railing against.
Okay, so what were those artificial inequalities that bothered him so much?
Basically, inequality of wealth and power that wasn't earned through merit. He was convinced that those at the top often got there through shady dealings, unscrupulous business practices was his term, not genuine talent or effort.
He was calling out the rigged system centuries ago.
Oh,
Makes you think about all those debates today about the global wealth gap, whether capitalism itself inherently creates an unfair playing field.
makes you wonder what Rousseau would make of our world today, doesn't it?
Oh, for sure. He'd probably have a lot to say about it. And that actually leads us to another interesting part of his thinking, his views on luxury, on what we often consider progress. He actually argued that luxury, art, even scientific advancement could lead to moral decay.
He did. It seems counterintuitive, right?
It does. We tend to think of progress as automatically good.
But Rousseau had a different take. He even compared Sparta, known for their simplicity and virtue, with Athens, which he saw as decadent and ultimately failing because of it. This idea that progress isn't always beneficial, it's a provocative one, especially for those of you studying IR, trying to wrap your heads around development and globalization. It really makes you think, how would Rousseau's critique of inequality play out on the global stage, with the huge disparities we see between nations?
Oh, yeah, the structure of the international system itself. Like you've got the Security Council, dominant economies, the effects of colonialism. It all seems to create inequality on a massive scale.
Exactly. And Rousseau's argument that those artificial inequalities, they come from unscrupulous practices, not merit. You could easily apply that to how some nations use their power globally.
It's like just as individuals might climb over each other for personal gain, some countries might use their economic or military might to kind of exploit others and stay on top.
That's one way to look at it. It resonates with theories like dependency theory. You know, the one that critiques the idea of universal progress and says the global economic system is designed to benefit developed nations at the expense of developing ones.
It's almost like that state of nature is playing out internationally, with nations competing for resources and dominance, just like those individuals in Rousseau's thought experiment.
That's a great connection. It really highlights the challenge of creating a truly fair and equal international system, where power isn't so concentrated in the hands of a few.
Rousseau would probably say we need some kind of global social contract, wouldn't he? Something to ensure fairness and cooperation on a global scale.
That's an interesting thought. But how would that even work in practice? Getting nations with such different interests and values to agree on rules that truly benefit everyone, it's tough.
It is. And to add another layer of complexity, Rousseau was pretty wary of progress, especially the kind driven by technology. But we've seen incredible technological advancements globally, especially in communication. How would you view that?
That's where applying Rousseau to the modern world gets tricky. On one hand, he might see these advancements as making inequality worse. You know, technology often concentrates wealth and power.
Yeah, think about the digital divide, the gap between those who have access to technology and those who don't. It's another level of inequality.
Exactly. But then again, you could also argue that these same technologies could empower marginalized communities, give a voice to the voiceless, and even promote global solidarity.
So it's a double-edged sword. He might be skeptical about technology distracting us from real human connection and civic engagement, but he also might see its power to connect us in ways he never imagined.
Definitely complex. And speaking of complex issues, let's get back to his ideas about luxury and moral decay. Remember how he seemed to idealize a simpler, more virtuous life, like in Sparta?
Right.
But is that even possible in today's world?
It makes you wonder, what would Rousseau think about our consumer-driven society? Our obsession with possessions and status symbols. Would he see it as a sign of moral decline?
He might say we've become so fixated on all the stuff that we've lost sight of what really matters. You know what it means to be human.
I can practically hear him saying it. But to be fair, he was writing in a very different time and context.
That's true. But even if we can't go back to a Spartan way of life, and let's be honest, most of us wouldn't want to, there's something valuable in his critique. He's pushing us to question our priorities, to ask ourselves if our pursuit of wealth and comfort is truly making us happier.
It's a good challenge to reflect on what a good life really means, and if our current systems are actually helping us achieve that vision. Which brings us to another key idea from Rousseau, dependence. He seemed to see any kind of dependence as a bad thing, something that erodes our freedom.
Yeah, he saw the state of nature as a time of self-sufficiency where you took care of yourself. But in civil society, with private property and specialized labor, we become dependent on each other. And that dependence, according to Rousseau, creates an imbalance of power.
So even things like relying on a farmer for food or a doctor for healthcare are inherently problematic.
Well, it's not quite that simple. But Rousseau was wary of the potential for dependence to be exploited. He was worried about those with more resources or power taking advantage of those who rely on them.
And that dynamic plays out on a global scale, too. Think about countries that depend heavily on foreign aid or the export of a single commodity. They're vulnerable to being exploited by more powerful nations or corporations.
Exactly. That's a perfect example of how Rousseau's ideas can be applied to international relations today. His work makes us ask tough questions about power, the potential for exploitation, and the challenges of creating a truly just world order.
It's like he's giving us a lens to view global politics. We can see those power dynamics more clearly.
Exactly. And that's why engaging with these classic thinkers is so crucial for anyone studying IR. They give you a framework for understanding the world and analyzing the problems we face.
So we've talked about Rousseau's critiques of inequality, his skepticism of progress, his concerns about dependence, and how these ideas relate to IR. Especially for those preparing for the UPSC, these are really valuable insights.
Absolutely. Rousseau makes us examine the nature of power, the purpose of society, and the potential for global cooperation. His work may be old, but it's incredibly relevant to the 21st century.
And there's one more big idea from Rousseau that we need to discuss, his concept of the general will. This is where things get really interesting, especially when we start thinking about governance and global cooperation.
You're right. The general will is at the core of his political philosophy. It's been both influential and controversial. Get ready, because we're about to dive into one of the most complex and fascinating ideas in political thought.
All right, the general will. Sounds kind of, I don't know, intimidating. I think I'm getting it. It's not just about what most people want, right?
Exactly. It's not just a head count, a majority vote. It goes deeper than that.
Okay, so how would you define it then?
The general will is about the collective will of the community, what's truly best for everyone, the common good.
So even if, say, most people voted for something that would actually harm the community in the long run, that wouldn't be the general will.
Right. Rousseau believed people could be mistaken about their own best interests or, put their own needs above the common good. But the general will, it's always focused on what's best for the whole, even if some individuals disagree.
That sounds, well, incredibly idealistic and maybe a little tricky to figure out in practice. How do you actually determine what the general will is? Seems pretty subjective.
Oh, it's definitely a challenge. Rousseau thought it emerges through thoughtful discussion, reasoned debate, where citizens really engage with each other, try to understand what's best for their community. It's not about imposing some preset agenda, but a process of discovery, consensus building.
And this is where it gets super relevant for international relations, right? If we're talking about global cooperation, climate change, poverty, all of that, we need some concept of a shared interest, a global common good.
Absolutely. You could see Rousseau's general will as a foundation for how nations can cooperate. Just like individuals, countries can come together, act in ways that benefit everyone, even if it means making some sacrifices.
That's a big if, though, isn't it? Assuming countries are actually willing to put aside their own self-interest and act for the greater good, we know that doesn't always happen in the real world.
You're not wrong. Realpolitik often wins out over idealism. But even if it's hard to achieve perfectly, that idea of a general will, a shared global interest, it at least gives us a framework for thinking about how nations could work together.
It's like a goal, something to strive towards.
Yeah, an aspiration. And it underscores how important dialogue is, communication between nations, to figure out where interests do align, where we can collaborate for the benefit of everyone.
So listeners, especially those UPSC folks with IR as your focus, remember this general will idea. It's a powerful concept for analyzing global politics, understanding how things work, maybe even how they should work.
And even beyond the exam, these are ideas that can help you be a more informed, engaged global citizen.
It's not just about acing a test. It's about understanding the world, thinking critically about these big issues. And who knows, maybe by studying these thinkers like Rousseau, we can even find some inspiration, for building a better future.
Couldn't agree more. So to wrap up our Rousseau deep dive, remember those key ideas: private property, inequality, the state of nature versus civil society, and especially that concept of the general will. Powerful stuff for understanding international relations.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for today. Make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the ideas that matter, the ones that'll help you understand the world and maybe even change it for the better. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and best of luck on those exams.